Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program for Monday, October 30th, 2023. This virtual program is titled The Poison Book Project, Arsenic and Other Heavy Metals in 19th Century Bookbinding. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California. It's my pleasure to welcome you all tonight and host the webinar. So for those of you that might be new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit and member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and the history of California and the West. The Book Club publishes limited edition, finely made books, a scholarly journal called the Quarterly Newsletter, and keepsakes for our members. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed, or if you're just simply interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition by becoming a member or a donor. Our membership dues are modest and the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members and our donors. So I encourage you to visit us online at bccbooks.org to join or donate to the book club. Okay. And now our speaker this evening is Dr. Rosie Grayburn, head of the Scientific Research and Analysis Laboratory at Winterthur Museum, Garden, and Library, and founding co-chair of the Bibliotoxicology Working Group. Her talk this evening is titled The Poison Book Project, Arsenic and Other Heavy Metals in 19th Century Bookbinding. Now, Dr. Grayburn joined the Scientific Research and Analysis Lab at Winterthur in 2017 as associate scientist and manager after 7 years in industrial and academic research. She received a Master of Science in Clinical Investigation in Chemistry from Imperial College London in 2010, and a joint PhD from the University of Ghent, Belgium, and Warwick University in the UK in 2015. From 2015 to 2017, she held a postdoctoral fellowship in conservation science at the Getty Conservation Institute, conducting research into coatings for outdoor bronzes in collaboration with J. Paul Getty Museum sculpture conservators and ion probe specialists at UCLA and the University of Delaware. Now, Dr. Grayburn has held teaching fellowships at the Department of Art History, the University of College London, and the Department of Physics, Warwick University. Now, the Poison Book Project investigates potentially toxic pigments used in the manufacture of Victorian-era bookcloth. Tonight, Dr. Grayburn will talk about the use of English bookcloth colored with highly poisonous emerald green pigment and other toxic pigments within a broader historical context. She'll talk about safe handling and storage practices for emerald green bookbindings and report on the Poison Book Project's most recent findings. If you have any questions or comments for our presenter or about the presentation itself, you can use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom. We will curate questions and comments from the Q&A and the chat for our discussion at the end of the presentation. And now I'm just thrilled to have Dr. Grayburn with us this evening. I know it's 3 hours later where you are there, Rosie, so thanks for being with us and staying up a little later. So without further delay, it's my pleasure to turn over the webinar controls to Dr. Rosie Grayburn.
Thanks, Kevin, for that very generous introduction. I am so thrilled to be with you all. I've told my young children who had just gone to bed that I'm giving a spooky bedtime story to 100 people in California, so I hope you all appreciate it. So I'm going to speak a little bit today about the Poison Book Project, but I can't really do that without acknowledging my research partner, Dr. Melissa Tadone. She and I have been on this poison book adventure since 2018, when we first discovered our first poison book together. And I wish she was here today with us. but I will do my best to present on behalf of both of us. This is really a joint effort between the two of us to lead this project. So what is the Poison Book Project? The Winterthur Poison Book Project investigates potentially toxic pigments which were used to color 19th century bookcloth, and it researches the best practices for mitigating the risks associated with these books. So today I'll talk about how the project began, what we've discovered so far, the avenues of research that we're currently pursuing for these decorated cloth case bindings. And the first focus of our work has been on green bookcloth, as you see on this slide in particular. This bright, vivid hue was achieved through the use of a toxic pigment, copper acetoarsenite, more commonly referred to as emerald green. So I just wanted to pause and share with you our University of Delaware Living Land Acknowledgement. Both Melissa and I are affiliated with the University of Delaware. So Melissa and I personally acknowledge that we have an ethical responsibility to consider how our research, our work, impacts our communities at the local, regional, and global level. And we strive to recognize the cost of the material culture that we study and the larger mechanisms of its creation. For example, the textile and paper mills that pollute the environment held sacred by Indigenous communities and on which we all rely, and the role of enslaved and exploited workers in the history of the book. So this book is where the Poison Book Project began. This is second edition volume of Rustic Adornments for Homes of Taste by Shirley Hibbard, was part of the circulating collection at Winterthur Library when it was requested for an exhibit being mounted in the Winterthur galleries. As you can see, the binding was compromised, and you can also see its brittle spine piece was completely detached. And so the book came to the Library Conservation Lab, where Melissa works, for treatment in early 2019. Successful bookcloths were a closely guarded trade secret during the 19th century, and our current understanding of their materiality is still incomplete. One of the areas least well understood is the dyes, pigments, and binders used to color the cloths. So as Melissa began conservation treatment on rustic adornments, she was working under the microscope to remove the waxy black marks that you can see here, I think, that were marring the surface of the book cloth. She used a porcupine quill for this task. It's something conservators have in their toolkit because it's softer and springier than a metal tool, but more durable than something like a bamboo skewer. But even working with great care, she noticed that the green colorant on the surface of this bookcloth was incredibly friable. It flaked loose very easily from the surface of the cloth. It just jumped straight off. And bright green is always a bit of a suspicious color in the art world. So just to be safe, Melissa reached out to me in Winterthur's Scientific Research and Analysis Lab, just on the off chance that we might be dealing with emerald green. And we are surely not the first people to wonder about emerald green bookcloth, but we did have the great fortune to be at an institution like Winterthur that has a scientific research lab that Melissa could turn to do that investigation. So Melissa and I were simultaneously gratified and horrified when analysis confirmed that the bookcloth was indeed colored with emerald green pigment. This discovery catalyzed the larger scale research effort that we call the Poison Book Project. And you might notice on the left-hand side of this slide, the image that the cloth on the spine is darker and more brown than the cloth on the front and the back. And I'll explain a little bit later why that is. So I'll pause here to clarify some of the confusion around the nomenclature for arsenic-based green pigments. There were many different common names in use during the 19th century for arsenic-based green pigments. Further adding to the confusion, contemporary historical sources sometimes mistakenly conflate the various arsenic-based greens. Scheele's green is one that's oftenly mistaken. It's a commonly used arsenic-based pigment, but it does have a slightly yellower hue, and it's not as light fast as emerald green. and it's chemically different from emerald green. It is copper arsenite. Emerald green was the name given to the compound copper acetoarsenite by German chemists who first synthesized it. You may be familiar with the other common names such as Schweinfurt green or Paris green. They all refer to the compound copper acetoarsenite. Emerald green was first synthesized around the turn of the 19th century, and commercial production was underway in Schweinfurt, Germany by 1814. Emerald green's toxicity was realized soon after it became widely available, so enterprising manufacturers began selling it as a pesticide as well as a colorant. Its popularity as a green colorant in everyday consumer products persisted in England and the United States throughout the 19th century. As I mentioned, emerald green is more light-fast than Scheele's green, but it is still susceptible to fading with interaction with sulfurous air pollution, which causes the brilliant green to darken to a greenish brown, as we saw on the images of rustic adornments. Victorians' obsession with brilliant greens is quite well documented. Arsenic-based pigments could be found in everything, from apparel to children's toys to packaging and to wallpaper. We actually recently found a month ago a chocolate box, which was coated in emerald green pigment in our ephemera collection at Winterthur Library. Consumers could not get enough of this vivid green hue, even as warnings began to circulate in the press about its health risks. So even as Victorian consumers were purchasing Paris green or emerald green as a rat poison and an agricultural insecticide, they continued to purchase home goods colored with the same pigment. And it's not necessarily that they were unaware or failing to make the connection. Beginning in the early 1860s, London newspapers documented the public outcry about emerald-containing greens. Alarmed medical practitioners and consumer advocacy groups warned women of the danger lurking in their evening gowns, colored with emerald green. And economists countered that a ban on the popular and widespread color would cause irreparable harm to the British economy. Can you believe it? As I will illustrate in greater detail later, emerald green bookcloth seems to emerge in the 1850s and somewhat precipitously decline in popularity after the 1860s. And it's interesting to consider whether the press coverage influenced a decline in the use of emerald green as a bookcloth. William Morris, who you may have heard of, celebrated designer of the arts and crafts movement, produced many wallpaper designs that contained emerald green and other arsenic-based dyes and pigments. Although he was a noted champion of workers' rights and safety, Morris actually inherited his fortune thanks to arsenic. The Morris family's arsenic mine reportedly produced as much as half of the world's supply of arsenic by 1870. And it was only near the end of his life that Morris finally divested himself of stock in the company. He actually took quite an antagonistic position to the public outcry over the use of emerald green, and he wrote in 1885 that it was hardly possible to imagine a greater folly than the so-called arsenic scare, jesting that if it was as if his detractors had been bitten by witch fever. As we know now, modern science contradicts Morris's position, and the quantities of arsenic in his wallpapers and other consumer goods were indeed enough to cause harm. So while historical accounts are rife with examples of accidental poisonings caused by emerald green wallpaper and wall paint, there are far fewer mentions of poisoning by book, which is what we're all talking about today. In this reported poisoning, shown here, a book was covered in glazed paper, and it was used by a young boy in New York as a watercolor palette. As he licked the tip of his brush, he ingested some of the arsenic and was taken violently ill. On the right is the sort of emerald green glazed paper binding, which we can imagine this article might be referring to. In addition to this binding, there are other recently discovered book bindings that also contain arsenic. For example, there was a quite highly publicized 16th century parchment bindings, which were colored in arsenic-based green paint in a Danish library and the Smithsonian back in 2018. And while these discoveries continue to enlighten us and create a more robust context for the use of toxic pigments in bookbinding histories, the Winterthur Poison Book Project continues to focus primarily on 19th century cloth bindings. In many ways, decorated cloth case publishers' bindings are emblematic of the Industrial Revolution, its opportunities, its democratization of the book trade, its enthusiasm for newly created and untested materials, its exploitation of workers, its hubris. The discovery of toxic bookcloth on bindings from this era only reinforces that symbolism. So now we'll switch to a little bit more a techie look at bookcloth. The first commercially viable bookcloth was invented in the 1820s, and initially it met with quite some resistance from the book buying public. However, as consumers realized that bookcloth was more affordable than leather or parchment and more durable than paper, it gained in popularity and was in wide use in England by the 1840s. To our current knowledge, many 19th century bookcloths were colored by applying a surface treatment rather than dyeing the cloth fibers directly. Bleached cotton cloth was padded, meaning a colored starch slurry was like scraped into the interstices of the weave. This process imparted color while also making the cloth more impervious to adhesive during the bookbinding process. The bookcloth was then backfilled with a machine like the one shown here. And then the backfill material was likewise composed of colorant mixed with starch and other fillers. The backfill sits on the surface of the cloth and serves the function of both a colorant and a coating. And this technique results in a brilliantly hued and durable bookcloth. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the surface can still be very vulnerable to abrasion. During the 19th century, publishers were consolidating their power and bringing the entirety of the book industry under their purview with their appealing, ready-bound retail products. The merits of cloth-bound books suited this agenda with their bright colors and eye-catching gold-stamped decoration. Between the 1830s and 1860s, book cloths were commonly embossed with decorative textures to hide the underlying weave. And sometimes this embossing happened as part of the manufacturing process, and sometimes it was a post-production embellishment carried out by the bookbinder. The 1850s and 60s were a time of transition towards simpler textures, with embossing textures falling out of favor in the last quarter of the century. Winterthur's rustic adornments displays a binding ticket for Wesley and Company, a prolific London bindery in the mid-19th century. Wesley & Co. bound several thousand books per week for a variety of London publishing houses. Wesley & Clark's bookbinding establishment was the predecessor of Wesley & Co. According to a contemporary source, bookcloth was purchased by the bindery in rolls and stored in a cloth warehouse where it was cut into pieces of several yards before being handed over to the cloth case makers. And you can see in this engraving the division of labor happening within the bindery. According to the same source, Wesley & Clark's reserved gilding for a higher class of bound books. And the majority of the emerald green bindings that we have currently identified were heavily decorated with gold stamping, which speaks to the target consumer demographic for books bound in this special color. So the presence of a friable toxic pigment on the exterior of a book in Winterthur Library's circulating collection caused significant concern for the safety of library staff and patrons alike. The more so because many Victorian-era cloth case bindings are housed in our circulating collection. People interact intimately with these books. We hold them close to our faces. We leave them stacked on our coffee tables where children or pets can reach them. We curl up and read them with a snack or a coffee in hand, and we don't expect the book that we've checked out from the library to be covered in a deadly poison. This concern prompted us to begin an analytical survey of the collections in order to better understand how many of our case bindings might be covered in potentially toxic bookcloth. We limited the time period of the survey to the Victorian era because by the turn of the 20th century, brightly colored light-fast aniline dyes had superseded many of the pigments and dyes that were popular in the 19th century. Using portable X-ray fluorescent spectroscopy, or XRF, for elemental identification, interns at Winterthur began analyzing 200 books in a range of colors. Where toxic elements were present, we followed with Raman spectroscopy, which tells us more about the compound identification. This initial survey revealed copper acetoarsenic, or emerald green, to be the pigment of most immediate concern. So after the first 200 books, testing continued on green bookcloth only. We narrowed the survey in this way in order to be able to work through the entire collection as quickly as possible and isolate any arsenic-containing books. So just before the pandemic shut down institutions here and all around the world, we were able to finish surveying green cloth bindings in the circulating and rare book collections at Winterthur, as well as the British and American publishers' binding collections at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And their collections were a dream to survey because they order their publishers' binding collection in date order. We're so grateful to our library company colleagues for allowing us this kind of access to their collections. So in total, across just 2 institutions, we tested 500 volumes, 350 of which were green, and of those, 39 were identified as containing arsenic pigment. So that's slightly more than 10% of the green bindings. So emerald green cloth bindings range in size from large quartos to petite duodecimos. However, there are some helpful commonalities. Our survey thus far has looked specifically at American or British imprints. And the majority of bindings we found have publication dates in the 1850s. A few were published in the 1840s, but this isn't necessarily an indication that emerald green bookcloth was being manufactured and used in the 1840s. It's just possible that these books were bound later. And likewise, it's possible that after the manufacture of emerald green bookcloth ceased, binderies may have had catches of the cloth that were used later. The emerald green bindings that we found, as I mentioned, tend to be highly decorated with gold and blind stamping, and they sometimes have gilt edges on the textbook. They're pretty bling. The bookcloth on the front and the back covers tends to remain a vivid green, but while the condition of the spine cloth tends to vary more, sometimes as a result of exposure to air pollution as it sits on a shelf, as I mentioned earlier. So you'll recall that the 1850s were a time of transition for embossed books. So on emerald green bookcloth, the most common textures we've seen so far have been a ribbed Morocco variation, as shown here on the left, and a diagonal wave, as shown on the right. This nomenclature comes from Andrea Krupp's publication, Bookcloth in England and America, 1823 to 1850. We've also seen just a plain weave that lets the color and gold decoration enjoy the spotlight. And we're looking forward to identifying more emerald green bindings and getting a better grasp of the variations in texture, because this may help us narrow down where the bookcloth was produced. And if you're wondering if all emerald green bindings are hidden away in library rare book collections, the answer is no. Not only did we identify several emerald green books in Winterthur Library circulating collections, these bindings are out in the world at large. Melissa discovered this binding of Longfellow's novel Kavanagh while casually perusing the shelves of our local secondhand bookstore. And then a few months later, Melissa purchased the Victorian children's book Grandpapa's Tales About Animals from an online auction site. she recognized the emerald green bookcloth on both of these bindings purely on the basis of visual familiarity. But after purchasing them, we did analyze them at Winterthur to confirm that they were both colored with emerald green. So these books are definitely out there in bookshops, auction houses, and private collections and in private homes. And actually, one of our students was recently at the Strand bookstore in New York City, and she was able to purchase an emerald green binding for $15 just this summer. So X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, which was the main scientific technique that we used to identify these bindings, it's a technique that can identify specific elements. So it can tell us whether arsenic is present or not. It's considered a qualitative rather than quantitative technique, so it tells us if something is there and not how much of something it is. So for example, when we get a strong signal for arsenic, we know that there's more than just a trace presence, but we don't have a number attached to that result. So our XRF survey of green bindings told us that arsenic was definitely present, but not how much arsenic. At this point, we asked ourselves if we were just being alarmist. We needed to understand just how toxic emerald green bookcloth potentially could be. So to this end, we sent a sample of emerald green bookcloth with permission from the library director to find some hard numbers. This type of analysis requires a destructive sample, and so we cut from underneath the paste down inside the back cover a 3 times 1 centimeter squared sample. And the results frankly astonished all of us. The analysis showed that this average size octavo book contained several times the lethal toxic dose of arsenic for an average size adult. The soil testing lab also analyzed a pickup test. We wanted to really simulate handling, how much arsenic is being offset onto our hands during handling of these books. So we rolled cotton swabs and swiped cotton pads over the surface of the bookcloth to mimic everyday handling. And the test results indicated that the offset of pigment dust from the surface of the bookcloth contained significant, measurable amounts of arsenic, even when that offset was not visible to the naked eye. So although there are still limitations to what these results tell us, we don't know if this one volume is representative of all emerald green bookcloth. We also don't know how much pigment this binding has already shed over its 200-year history. So in trying to understand the actual risk that arsenical bookcloth poses, we have discussed this research with several experts from various fields associated with health and safety. So a forensic toxicologist, an epidemiologist, and an industrial hygienist. Each of these disciplines considers risk differently. The forensic toxicologist, Justin Brower, who works for the Office of the Medical Pathologist in North Carolina, and his attitude was, well, as far as we know, no one has ever died from exposure to arsenical bookcloth, coming at it from the risk of perception of pathology. Is this a likely cause of death? He sees these books as low risk. He does acknowledge that there are legal liabilities, so institutions may need to act with an abundance of caution. Epidemiologist Dr. David Goldsmith is less focused on fatality as the primary risk factor. His research draws a causal relationship between silica exposure and the development of autoimmune diseases. So he has a deep interest in the way that materials that we interact with in our daily life may trigger serious long-term health issues. So he considers problems from a long-term, low-grade exposure to arsenic to be a potential public health concern. And then finally, the safety recommendations that we follow at Winterthur come from our consultation with an industrial hygienist, the former University of Delaware Director of Environmental Health and Safety, Michael Gladle. From his perspective, there are no safe exposure limits for emerald green. So limiting direct contact, inhalation, ingestion, insofar as possible, is absolutely essential. So how do we protect ourselves and others when we have emerald green books in our collections, whether those collections are in a library or in our homes? Well, we have these pretty simple handling instructions that we share with patrons at our library. And when handling emerald green books, we suggest that you wear nitrile gloves, and you can purchase these at nearly any pharmacy or hardware store. You want to take care to avoid ingestion or inhalation of the pigment dust. And you may not see any pigment dust. It's just best to assume that it's there. So it's best to wash your hands after eating or smoking. And this probably sounds pretty familiar, but avoid touching your face and eating until you can wash your hands, even when you have worn gloves to handle these arsenical bindings. And then making sure that you handle the bindings only on hard surfaces, which can be wiped down with a damp disposable cloth afterwards. I would avoid setting this type of book cloth on an upholstered or permeable surface. And then at Winterthur, we've decided to house our arsenical green books in zip-top polyethylene baggies. I know they're not the most beautiful storage option. We have looked at other storage options like Colibri and boxes. But if any pigment sheds from the book cloth, the zip top bag, the seal keeps it contained. And then we can easily see the binding without opening the bag. And then the bag is also easy to label with a hazard warning and the handling precautions as well. It's also pretty accessible. So going back to emerald green, as you can see in this histogram, emerald green book cloth enjoyed immense popularity in the 1850s. But the majority of the green book cloth we have analyzed has actually turned out to be a different pigment altogether, chrome green. Chrome green is a color created by combining chrome yellow with Prussian blue, two very commercially popular pigments in the Victorian times. The ratio between these two color components can vary, resulting in a wide range of greens, even though they aren't all technically chrome green. They are all technically chrome green, rather. So with chrome green book cloth, we don't have the same consistency in hue that we see with emerald green book cloth. And you'll be happy to hear that chromium is not nearly as toxic as the heavy metal arsenic, but it is also it is a heavy metal. So we recommend hand washing after handling these types of books too. But you probably don't need to wear nitrile gloves. One of the primary goals of our research is to use our position as an institution with analytical resources to assist others that don't have this capability. And so we developed the color swatch bookmark pictured here. This bookmark shows emerald green book spines from our collection on one side and emerald green boards on the other. And we worked with a local printer and checked the proofs against our emerald green bindings to ensure that the printed color was true to life. It may not be a perfect tool, but it can only give a visual identification that a book might be bound in emerald green book cloth. But we have come to believe that the bookmark can be highly effective because emerald green book cloth is remarkably consistent in hue. And they're very, very recognizable. You grow very attuned to the color. So let's just play a quick game. You can all look over this selection of green bindings and just take a second to see if you can guess which ones are emerald green and which ones are chrome green. I'll just give 3 seconds. So these books here were the ones found in emerald green pigment. And these ones are bound in chrome green pigment. So I'll show you the full image again. So we have emerald green and chrome green. There are a few that kind of are on the edge of which ones I'm visually discerning between chrome green and emerald green. For me, the trickiest of the bunch is this petite emerald green volume here that's right on the cusp. It could be dark enough that it could have been chrome green, but it isn't, it's emerald green. And another one is this one here, which really looks like the right color to be emerald green, but it's actually chrome green. And incidentally, this book cloth has a wide vertical ribbed embossing pattern that we haven't seen on any emerald green book. So this could be an additional clue. So visual identification isn't foolproof, but if it's accurate just 80% of the time, it definitely seems worth it. So our bookmarks have been pretty popular. To date, we've sent around 4,000 bookmarks to all 49 US states, plus the District of Columbia. This map is not up to date. And also 29 countries on 6 continents. Version 2 of the bookmark also included images of bookbinding paper as well as bookcloth. And this was thanks to a contribution from Northwestern University, who've been focusing their research on paper bindings. And we're now on version 3 of the bookmark. If you locate England on this map, and then consider how bookcloth and cloth-bound books would have spread along trade routes into English colonies, the countries with collections of interest for this project really make sense. The majority of bookmarks have been sent to institutions in the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, with some going to South Africa, the Caribbean, and other European countries. The bookmarks serve 2 purposes. First and foremost, we hope they'll bring librarians, book dealers, and private collectors, help them to identify suspicious green bindings in their collections. And we also hope that people who receive the bookmark will consider contributing data to the Poison Book Project. The books we've identified so far through instrumental analysis form the core of our database. And we hope that folks at other institutions will contribute data that they collect in their own institutions as well. We accept data corroboration in the form of XRF or Raman spectra, photomicrographs using polarized light microscopy. One of our former postgraduate fellows in paintings conservation at Winterthur developed a polarized light microscopy protocol to assist with the identification of emerald green bookcloth, and we're happy to make that document available to anyone on request. Right now, we know of several institutions who are actively working to borrow an XRF spectrometer to scan their collections, and they've agreed to share their spectra with us. However, we also hope that bookmark recipients will share their visual data with us. So for example, if you receive a color swatch bookmark and find a suspiciously vivid green cloth binding with a publication date between 1823 and 1900, we ask that you take a photograph of the book positioned next to our bookmark, just like the one on this slide. And you can submit this as a JPEG, along with the bibliographic data for the binding. When users search the database, the listing for each binding will say whether the corroborating evidence come from instrumental analysis or visual identification, so users can understand the varying degree of confidence about the identification. So I've talked a lot about emerald green bookcloth today, but I did want to just go back, and we really started this project concerned about all cloth case bindings in the Winterthur Library. We started surveying a rainbow of bindings. And just quickly to mention that we have been able to identify most of the colorants in other bookcloth from the Victorian era. So we found that mercury is contained in a lot of red bindings, but we're not really sure what the compound is yet. Chrome orange and chrome yellow, which contain chromium and lead, have been found in orange and yellow bindings. These are my favorite ones. Chromium and lead are both heavy metals, and so again, washing hands after handling is sufficient. And then we've mentioned chrome green, the mixture of chrome yellow and Prussian blue, present in 90% of green bindings from that era, and then what we like to call the benign blues, which do not contain heavy metals. They may contain traces of lead from the manufacturing process, but mostly the blues seem to contain either synthetic ultramarine or Prussian blue, which are pretty safe to handle. So using toxic components to make material culture is something humans have done since antiquity. This was not new to the Industrial Revolution. What was new was the scale on which it was happening and the impact this had on people of the period, the workers and the consumers. Likewise, this large scale of toxic materials for industrial production creates an ongoing legacy for those of us who collect, study, and care for material collections. And we need more research and partnerships in order to understand how to do this safely. So Melissa and I co-founded the Bibliotoxicology Working Group last year in 2022. And our aim was to bring together professionals working with collections, whether that be conservators, scientists, book historians, librarians, collections care professionals of all flavors, and bring them together to discuss strategies for safer management of these types of collections, to share ideas about helping to identify these toxic substances in book bindings and archival materials, and also make information more publicly accessible. So these are all things that our working group is currently working on. We're currently aiming to publish some white papers, which will be available openly for anyone who wants to access them, on subjects ranging from the identification of toxic substances to how to communicate about these hazardous collections to the public and to your managers and to the directors. So if you would like to request an emerald green bookmark, there may be a little bit of a wait. We rely on volunteer help to send those out to participants. But if you would like to get in line, then please email your postal address to this email address here, reference@winterthur.org, with emerald green bookmark in the subject line. So that's emerald green bookmark in the subject line. If you still have questions about the project after our Q&A session today, you are very welcome to email me directly. And then Melissa and I update this website here, our wiki, on the Poison Book Project regularly. So please visit that page to learn about current updates. You can also just Google Poison Book Project Winterthur, and that should take you to our website. But finally today, I just wanted to really give a shout out to all of our partners and contributors to the Poison Book Project thus far. Melissa and I are very grateful to have the contribution of all of these people, both at Winterthur, but also at external institutions and also the data contributing institutions that are helping to enrich our poison book database on our website. So thank you again for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm very excited to hear about your questions, and yeah, I'm excited to hear from you guys.
Hi, I'm back. Maybe I know you want to leave this up for a second, but if you want to go back to leave the contact slide up for just for a minute before we get into some questions, and then we can drop the slides. And I will say, first of all, thank you for this alarming and disturbing lesson on emerald green and heavy metals and toxic book cloth. It is really perfect timing in terms of a creepy story to tell book lovers like those at the Book Club of California with this history. And it's so interesting that it started with, it's all about this obsession, which is very horror related, of consumers with this brilliant color. And it includes a poisoning of probably many people over time, right? The craftsmen who are involved, the book lovers who have snuggled up with their book and their coffee, and now librarians and collectors who have this these books in their collection. It's a pretty scary story. So thank you for sharing it with us on this Halloween Eve.
No worries. These books are absolutely stunning. I hope that you can all see one day safely in a Ziploc bag.
Yeah, I
They
think
are
we're all
beautiful.
yeah, well, I think we're all like you said, gratified and horrified at the same time for your for sharing this important project with us. Some of the things that I had questions about, and some of the questions I think in the chat, you've talked a little bit about in terms of like how toxic is toxic when we're talking about these bindings. But I think, oh, the other one was like what other colors and should we be worried about, and you kind of covered that as well, which is great. There are some questions in the chat. I'm going to pull them up, and this was one that I was thinking about too, about were your colleagues at Winterthur donned with special PPE during their research and their testing for the toxicity when they were finding these books? Like, what's happening like on the ground when you are handling books?
Sure. So actually, thanks to our colleagues at Northwestern University, they were equally as alarmed when we found this emerald green book cloth, and they were very concerned, or rather their health and safety department were very concerned about the dust coming off the book cloth during handling and inhalation happening. So they did a ton of research to measure the dust, and there is actually no measurable dust coming off the book. So the only thing you have to worry about is via handling and then somehow touching your face afterwards. So the only PPE that we recommend, that's the only PPE we used when we were handling the books during the initial survey, was nitrile gloves. And that's all we use now to handle our emerald green books. If you were a conservator and doing a treatment on a book and actively prodding and doing invasive treatment on a book like this, then we would recommend that you use even more PPE, maybe a mask, and definitely a fume hood. So not having it out on an open workbench. But if you're just handling the book, then there's no risk of inhalation, but do wear nitrile gloves.
Yeah, there's a great question or concern, I guess, about just selling. Like you mentioned, colleagues just bought at an auction or bought in a secondhand store. Like, how is that? What are you doing about that? Is there an education element of that you need to reach out to people, like that this can just happen? Like you can sell poisonous books on the open market, I guess is what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, we're really trying to spread the word to booksellers about the project. We've been providing bookmarks to booksellers locally and whenever we travel. But in terms of ethics of selling them, we haven't really broached that. It's up to them to communicate that and decide what they want to do with their collections.
Okay. There was a question about, do you have a list or a database of known titles and publishers? And I think somebody put the link up in the chat.
Yes. Thank you very much. Bob, I think, put that in the chat.
Yeah, Bob, there it is. I just saw it. So if you wanted to find that in the chat, that's a great resource to get a list of titles or publishers or the known culprits, I guess, out there in the world.
Yes. So we have a list of just around, thank you, Bob, just about 200 titles that we know have been bound in emerald green book cloth. This is an ever-growing list. And you can just go on that and sort of search it manually to see if it corroborates with the book that you may have in your possession.
Dale had a great question, and I kind of mentioned this about any research into the workers' health, the people who were binding, or putting together, handling the book cloth. What are your thoughts on that? Like,
there's definitely a lot of literature at the time around health and safety for workers, but we haven't been able to find any yet specifically around arsenical book cloth. There's a lot around, like asbestos at the turn of the 19th century. the felting industry for hats. There's a lot of literature around the effect that had on the women that worked in those factories. People who used this type of pigment for painting onto fake flowers for accessories. There are documented cases of workers falling ill and actually passing away as a result of working alongside these types, but we haven't found anything yet around the bookcloth industry. I know that Melissa is planning to do significant archival research soon, and I hope that that topic will be broached during that.
Yeah, there's an interesting question about looking at end papers of books as well, because we talked a lot about the bookcloths, right, on the outsides of the books. What about end papers and other elements of a book that might be toxic?
So end papers, we have found that some end papers, I think Melissa found a book where one of the end papers was doped in emerald green pigment. A lot of time we find that end papers are made of some kind of leaded material as well. So again, just washing your hands after handling the book is sufficient. And also on the foredge as well. So you may be familiar with red foredges. We have found some emerald green foredges as well. I think they're in our database if you look at our website. But red foredges, they are still made from vermilion, which is a mercuric sulfide pigment. Mercury in that form is not as toxic as elemental mercury, which you can breathe, like from a thermometer. If the thermometer breaks, that's really bad for your health. There does need to be more research done on the health effects of handling those books. But again, if you wash your hands after handling, then that seems to be sufficient for most of these pigments, with the exception of emerald green.
I'm going to just scan the Q&A to see if there's anything in here. Oh, are any pigments used in marbling thought to be
Good question.
toxic? Yeah.
We know of a Mexican researcher who did her thesis on this topic, but we haven't investigated this fully. It is absolutely possible that emerald green pigment was used in marbling for end papers,
yeah. Yeah, it would seem likely. I would think, right, if it was so popular at the time and in demand.
Yes.
There is Ricky put an interesting question about, do you think toxicity could be purposefully put in by manufacturers for some reason?
It's a very interesting question, Ricky.
Yeah.
So Melissa and I often grapple with this because there does seem to be some kind of cognitive dissonance between the users, at least, reading these books, buying the wallpaper that contained emerald green, buying chocolates in an emerald green containing case, and then using that same green colorant to put on their fields and down their drains to kill rats. So it's curious to us. I'm not sure if the manufacturers did it on purpose. I think they were just thinking about the economics, and they knew Victorians loved bright colors. So I don't think it was purposely put in, and I think that's why we also see a tailing off of the use of emerald green, because it is so much more toxic than other pigments, and I really like 1,000 times more. I think it was much more noticeable, that effect on the population, and that's why we see a tailing off. But we haven't been able to find the research to really pinpoint that.
Right. So these days, today, what are the toxic, heavy metals, I'm pretty sure, are not being used today in the production of books. Are there any concerns or worries or field of study for the current production of books and something that might be harmful?
I think probably the hot topic nowadays is the use of plastics and the production of microplastics. And that getting into water sources and into the food chain. And we really don't understand the long-term effects of microplastics. And the book industry is just a small part of that, of course. All the polymers that are present in coatings, in books, and in bindings. That's the only thing I can really think of. I know that inks are pretty benign nowadays.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're almost at the top of the hour, but I have to ask this question because before we got started today, we talked a little bit about your recent travels and your speaking tour. So I'm curious to know what a typical day is like for you. Are you out there on the road speaking? Are you in the lab like testing things? Are you writing white papers? Like what's your day like?
So for Melissa and I, we do a lot of outreach for this project. I think we maybe give on average one talk a week about the Poison Book Project. Last week was special. I gave 2 talks. This week we're giving 3 talks about the project to different audiences. So that really forms a lot of our work. And yes, we're writing these white papers, communicating with a different audience, a professional audience. And then a lot of my work is also analyzing these books as well. So when Melissa and our library colleagues flag new books or flag books that may have hidden emerald green, we have a lot of illuminated bindings that have emerald green on the boards, but not on the spine. They'll come to the lab and then I'll analyze them using the analytical equipment in my lab. And then there's a lot of documentation that goes into that as well, making sure that the people who need that information have that information.
Got it. Sounds like a lot of work. There's the big team behind you. I couldn't believe all those people that you had to thank as being part of the project. That's
Yes,
a lot of people.
A lot of interns and students, and it takes a village to make a new research project. So we're very grateful for our partners.
I will say that I'm personally surprised that there's not an arsenic and heavy metal like hotline that somebody should pick up the phone and call. I've got a book. I need to get it out of my house or get rid of it. I think what you're, for folks who are concerned, I think the concern is you should be concerned. You should check it out. You should get a bookmark to see what you have, but you can live with these books in your collection in the right kind of storage. And you talked about that during today's talk. So don't feel like you have to, throw everything out. Don't burn it, because that's probably worse to put all that.
we would never recommend disposing of these books. There are safe ways that you can store them and enjoy them in the ways that I described, using the Ziploc bags, and you can handle them safely as well. And we've been able to find that out. So just keep enjoying this interesting part of material culture.
Just safely enjoy it.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for spending your night with us. I know it's late where you are. There's a lot of great accolades coming in on the chat and the Q&A. I'm going to send you all of the comments and questions in the Q&A. If there's something we didn't get to that you think we should respond to, you and I can figure that out and make that happen. But I don't want to keep you too much longer on this late Monday night. Thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate it. Any last words before I wrap up and sign off?
Don't lick the books, folks.
Wise words of counsel there. Don't lick the books. So on behalf of the Book Club of California, I really do want to thank you for speaking to us this evening. And I want to thank everyone who took time out of their schedule to join us for this presentation. I hope you'll join us for our next event, which is titled Paul Elder, A Literary Life in 7 Bookstores, on Monday, November 6th at 6 p.m. That's an in-person event here at the book club, but it will also be Zoomed, so you can join us in person or virtually. It'll be the 5th installment of the Kenneth Carmiole Endowed Lecture on the history of the book trade in California and the West. Our speaker is book collector, curator, and historian David Mastardi. You can register for that event or any book club event online at bccbooks.org/programs, or you can use the link in the emails that you're probably getting from the Book Club of California. If you're not getting an email from the Book Club of California about our events, just email me and I'll make sure you get it. I'm kevin@bccbooks.org. So thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be well, stay healthy, and stay safe on Halloween and every day. Thank you, everyone.